With our unit on world religions behind us, we are now sort of entering the home stretch. And with the time that we have left, I have cobbled together a plan as far as the videos and the instruction that we're going to be doing. We're going to look at India, and then China, and then Japan and Korea, and then the Dark Ages in Europe and in Britain, and throughout the region that was known as the Roman Empire in the West. So that's sort of loosely the plan. Now, I reserve the right to modify or add or do this, but anyway, um, this brings us to a new set of challenges because it's one thing to look at religions, it's completely another thing to look at entire civilizations in the span of one video. So let me start off by giving the obvious caveat. This is not exhaustive. What we're going to be looking at is not all of the information, for instance, on India that you will need. But what I've tried to do is to take what I would do in the classroom and condense it and just give you the beats. And uh, the textbook is very useful. And we've already looked at a little bit of India when we looked at Hinduism and Buddhism and the caste system. So that's sort of an advantage. So let's just go ahead and dive in and begin a look at the subcontinent of India. Now, if you remember the way, excuse me, if you remember the way that we introduce a people group or a civilization, the very first thing that we try to do, if it's possible, is to look at the geography. And so let's talk about the geography of India for a minute. Now, I have been fortunate enough to actually go to India. The year 2008, I was part of a trip that went to, we went to Bangalore. I've been to Calcutta. We went to Nepal, the city of Kathmandu. So I've been in this part of the world. Remarkably beautiful and very, very different from anything that I'd ever experienced. So I feel very fortunate to have that advantage while we're talking about the geography of India. The first thing you need to know about the geography of India is that it is a subcontinent. It is large enough a protrusion like coming off of Asia, so it's not included in that landmass, and so India is a subcontinent. It is below an existing continent. The dominant feature, other than the rivers, the Indus and the Ganges, the dominant feature of the subcontinent of India is the Deccan Plateau, which is sort of in the middle of the subcontinent. Very fertile land, lush jungles. It's absolutely beautiful. And the other thing we need to know about the geography of India, it's a subcontinent, the Deccan Plateau is in the center, it's the dominant geographic feature. The other thing we need to know is monsoons. The part of the world that we live in, we experience, we're supposed to experience 4 seasons. Alabama's completely off the chain sometimes, but there are 4 seasons in this part of the world. There is a summer, there's a fall, there's a winter, and then there's a spring. In India, on the subcontinent of India, essentially the weather is dominated by wind patterns that are called monsoons. Now, and I've even been guilty of this, a lot of people equate monsoons with just rain. It's not accurate. Monsoons bring rain, so let's talk about that. Monsoons are dominant wind patterns that in the winter they blow from the east to the west, and they bring drier, cooler air. In the summer, the most important of the monsoons go from the west to the east, and they bring the rain that is necessary for the crops. And so the summer monsoons bring rain and warmth off the Indian Ocean, and that affects the climate and what will grow and what will not grow. The Deccan Plateau is very, very fertile ground. And when farming does start, they're going to have a lot of very familiar crops: rice, wheat. So the dominant features that I want you to know about are the monsoons, the Deccan Plateau, and that India is a subcontinent. So let's talk about the first civilization. The first civilization in this region of the world actually exists now in modern day Pakistan, which is India's closest neighbor to the west, in the Indus River Valley. And the two main cities were Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. And so this civilization is referred to by archaeologists as the Harappan civilization. It existed from about 5,000 years ago. Around 2600 BC, that's when there was firmly the Indus River Valley and its tributaries would flood and bring the silt up on the land, that organic material that came in the floodwaters, and the water went away. Very good to farm, just like on the Nile River Valley and in other river valleys that we're going to talk about. Same in Mesopotamia. But there were more tributaries and more acreage that the Indus River Valley covered in this area. So it was very, very fertile. Farming caught on very, very quickly. By 2600 BC, there were cities. These were well planned out cities. They had gridded streets. They had a central well system inside the cities. There was a means of communicating with one another and from one person to another, using sometimes very elaborate personal seals with pictures or inscriptions on them. These have been found as far away as Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamian bronze has been found in this region. And so we know that the Indus River Valley civilization and the Mesopotamian civilization were trading. And so about the time that the Great Pyramid was being built, Harappan civilization was thriving. That's about 2500 BC, 2400 BC. And then this first civilization will do something that civilizations do in history from time to time. It will disappear. The people, according to archaeological evidence, just abandon the cities. This happens around 1900 BC. There are a lot of explanations that theorists have posed and that archaeologists have offered. There are three that you could, I suppose, look at the closest. Number one, the people overfarmed the land. I don't know about that one. Two, invasion. And the next people we're going to talk about were active. I don't know about as early as 1900 BC, but we know by 1500 BC. So it's only 300-400 years. Invasion could have been it, or my favorite theory, earthquakes. Earthquakes have an interesting effect on rivers. They can literally change the flow of a river, depending on what rock is broken away, and parts of a river may actually go underground. If the people were suddenly finding themselves located in a place where you can't grow enough food to sustain large populations, and some of these city-states, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, they maxed out at about 35,000 people just in those two cities. We're talking about a large population. If the rivers, because of earthquakes, diverted, there was no way to feed the people, it would make sense that the people would gradually leave. So the first civilization is the Harappan civilization. We're going to go ahead and say extremely advanced, because of one of the features in both Harappa and Mohenjo-daro that I did not mention. They actually had indoor plumbing. Inside the houses there were drains for wastewater, and then under the streets, the main streets of the city, that took from other sources, pushing the wastewater, took the waste out of the city. So they actually had indoor plumbing, gridded streets, sophisticated agriculture and ways of trade, means of trade, trading as far away as Mesopotamia. But 1900 BC, and they're gone. About 400 years after that, between 1500 BC and 1000 BC, we see our next group of people. They're the Aryans. Now, you need to be very careful here. The Aryans are not an ethnic group of people. They're not like the Jewish people or another ethnic group of people. That's not the way to think of the Aryans. The Aryans are actually related to a larger group of people that archaeologists refer to and linguists refer to as Indo-Europeans. Now, the Indo-Europeans are tied together by a common root spoken language. You can see the impact of this Indo-European language all the way into European languages such as English and into Hindi, which is the modern language of India. And so this group of people who had this language had a large effect, a massive effect on the way that people communicated. And a part of these people who spoke this language were the Aryans. Between 1500 BC and 1000 BC, they will begin to migrate down into mainland India. Now, there are people already in India, perhaps they're the descendants of the people who left the Harappan civilization. Perhaps they're just indigenous people who'd lived tribal lives for quite some time. But there are already people there. And so the Aryans, and we talked about this in the beginnings of Hinduism, the Aryans who came down through the passes of the Himalayas and other ways, they mixed with the indigenous Indian people. Now, the Aryans were horseback shepherds. They were herders. They had cattle. And they had never experienced a settled life. When they got into India, they met the people who were there. They began to intermarry and intermingle with these people, and they began to transition into a more settled life. They did keep farming cattle, though. They did keep raising cattle. At some point, and I had a student ask me, this is what I was waiting to tell that student. Why do the people in India think cattle are sacred? Well, some of it actually has to do with Hinduism and life and Brahman, but some of it actually has to do with the Aryan people who came down. Those cattle that they had in the beginning, they were a symbol of status and wealth, and eventually they will begin to see these cattle that they will continue to raise even though they're farming. They'll see the cattle as sacred, and so they will over time outlaw the killing and eating of cattle, but they'll continue to raise them, and they'll see these animals as sacred. So between Hinduism and Brahman and life and the way the Aryans developed their view of cattle, that explains the sacred nature of the cattle today, or it's the beginning of the explanation of the sacred nature of cattle in India. And so when the Aryans come down, they mix with the people who were there, and they began to form tribes. These tribes, not really kingdoms, just kind of tribes. They're ruled by, the nobles go by the name of Raja. And so that's where we are a little after 1000 BC, the development of these tribes. Now, from about 1000 BC to the early 300s BC, this system will become a little more elaborate, a little more settled in. Hinduism is beginning to form and take root and take shape. Sanskrit is beginning to take root and take shape, the written language. And believe it or not, now it's time to talk about Alexander of Macedonia. Alexander is still affecting things. Well, what did Alexander have to do with India? Well, in 325 BC, Alexander had, it was almost when the only army that ever beat him, his own. Right before his troops compelled him to let's go back, let's go home, which they didn't go home, they went to Babylon, different story. But right before they had the talk with Alexander, Alexander was actually making invasions into India. And these small kingdoms that were ruled by Rajas, even though they'd have several hundred years to develop, they were nowhere close to ready to fight Alexander. No, nobody was. The Persians were. Nobody was. Um, but they were nowhere ready. And then, almost as if it was just a mercy, out of nowhere, almost as quickly as Alexander began to make those incursions into the area where the Rajas and those kingdoms were, he left. Now we know that Alexander's troops compelled him to march back, and they went back to Babylon, and then he died. But in 325 BC, this was the wake-up call that this area, this developing ancient India needed. This is the beginning of the first empire. Chandragupta is a Raja who will realize that there are threats in the world that they're not ready for. 325 BC, Alexander goes away. 321 BC, Chandragupta begins conquering, and he creates the first empire in Indian history, the Mauryan Empire. There'll be two that we'll talk about. So, what have we got so far? We got the geography. We've got the Indus River Valley civilization, which disappeared in 1900 BC. We've got the Aryans coming down from 1500 BC to 1000 BC, the development of the Rajas and these small tribal communities, the wake-up call from Alexander. And now, in 321 BC, we see Chandragupta begin creating the first empire in Indian history. This is the Mauryan Empire. It will have some very interesting aspects to it. The world's first Buddhist king or emperor will be in the Mauryan Empire. Now, the Chandragupta and most of the leaders of this empire are going to be Hindu, practicing Hinduism. But Ashoka, and that's this emperor's name, is a Buddhist, and he converts to Buddhism late in life. The story is that after a battle that he led, he looked around on the battlefield and saw the suffering and the dying and the hurt people, and he decided that he wanted to live for peace instead of war, and he converted to Buddhism. And so in the Mauryan dynasty, you have the world's first Buddhist emperor, and he did a pretty good job. He was loved by his people, and he did a variety of things which definitely left his mark. He encouraged laws that promoted peace toward people and encouraged peace. He founded hospitals for people and for animals. And Ashoka also was known for planting shade trees along the roads so that weary travelers could rest. He was well loved by his people, and it was a very interesting development in the Mauryan dynasty. Oddly enough, it was very close to the end of the Mauryan dynasty, because after Ashoka died, there was a line of rulers that just butted heads with the people. The Mauryans were falling out of favor with the people. They raised taxes and made laws that the people thought were unreasonable. In fact, in 183 AD, the last Mauryan king was assassinated by one of his own generals. That's some Roman stuff right there. And so the Mauryan dynasty is the first dynasty that we talk about, and founded by Chandragupta. Interesting facet would be Ashoka, the first Buddhist emperor. Then you have 500 years of chaos, kingdoms fighting one another, and eventually you will have the second major empire in India. It will be founded by Chandragupta. And Chandragupta will begin the Gupta dynasty. So the first dynasty in Indian history is the Mauryan dynasty. The second dynasty is the Gupta dynasty. Now, the founder of the dynasty won't rule very long at all, but his son, Samudra Gupta, uh, will usher in what historians agree is the golden age of ancient India. Um, and Samdragupta was sort of I suppose in European terms, be a Renaissance man. He was not only a very, very successful military leader. They conquered this Gupta Empire, conquered all of northern India, modern day northern India. But also under Samdragupta, the arts flourished, writing and sculpture and poetry. Excuse me. He also encouraged Hindu. He also encouraged Hindu priests and scholars. And under Samdragupta, there were a lot of Hindu temples that were built. And there were some scientific achievements that I have to mention. Some of you will love this. Some of you will not like this. India is responsible, in the Golden Age under the Gupta Empire, India is responsible for the creation of the numeral 0. They were the very first ones to come up with a number that represented nothing. Now, we understand today the world that opens up in place value in the modern mathematics. But India were these mathematicians and scientists were the first ones to come up with a representation for nothing. On the other side of that, they also came up with an understanding of everything because they were the first people to really tackle and explain the idea in the Gupta Golden Age under Chandragupta, to try to capture and explain the idea of infinity. And in the Golden Age under Chandragupta, the first scientists used algebra. So there's a lot of information there. So let's go back over the beats real quick before we close it out. We have the geography, subcontinent, Deccan Plateau, monsoons. West brings the wet, brings the rain. You have the Indus River Valley civilization, which flourishes and then disappears. Then you have the Aryans migrating in from 1500 to 1000 BC, mixing with the people, settling down. A little explanation about the sacred nature of cattle. You have Alexander. Then you have the birth of the Mauryan Empire from a Raja who said, we're not ready for whatever's out there. Began conquering. You have the Mauryan Empire. Then you have Ashoka. Then you have the decline and the end of the Mauryan Empire. Then 500 years of nothing, chaos, fighting, squabbling. Then you have the Gupta Empire. And under the founder's son, Samdragupta, the golden age of this amazing country. India is full of traditions. We have talked about in a video already the caste system, which plays a huge part in understanding the social and political and religious underpinnings of Indian civilization. It's fascinating people, fascinating group of empires that we've looked at. I encourage you, watch the video more than once and take a look at the corresponding pages in the text.